The most common types of records we'll have in DNS will be this host A record. Sometimes it's called a host record, sometimes it's called an A record. The A just stands for address. You'll most often hear it referred to as host A though. That's what you're usually going to hear. This is nothing but a name to an IP version 4 address. So it'll look something like RTS-client1 equals 10.11.27. That's the way it'll look. It just takes a name, resolves that name to an IP address. We also have a host quad A, is what we call this. This resolves a name to an IP version 6 address. Now, IP version 6 is still not extremely common. I mean, most networks, all networks, are still running IP version 4. Some may use IP version 6 in addition to that, but IPv4 is still the standard everywhere you go. But it works the same. It just takes a name, resolves it to an address, just an IP version 6 address. So those two, just very similar. I also have an alias. Now, this is sometimes called a CNAME, but more often than not, you'll hear people call it an alias. An alias is actually a made-up name. For example, if I do have my host record for RTS client 1, and that equals at 10.11.27, like we just said. But let's say this is a web server, and I want you to type www.mydomain rtsnetworking.com, we'll say. But when you type www, I want www to act as a computer name and actually resolve to this RTS client 1. To do that, I would already have a host record that says RTS client 1 equals this address. I would then come create an alias that says www resolves to RTS client 1. So truly it's just a made up name that resolves to a record you already have in DNS. www would be the most common example of that. We also have these service location records. Everyone calls them SRV records or serve records. What this does is resolve a service ultimately down to an IP address. The most common example of this is when you log on, every time you try to log on to the domain, like with your user account from your client computer, you have to locate a domain controller. Well, the way that process works, you send a query to DNS saying, I'm trying to log on and I need to use this Kerberos authentication service. DNS, can you tell me who hosts this Kerberos authentication? That's a service request because you don't know the name of a domain controller. You just know the type of service that you need to access. DNS is going to have a record for the Kerberos service. It's going to look at that record, get the IP address, send it back to you. The last record we have here is a pointer record. This is for a reverse lookup. This record takes an IP address and resolves it to a name. So this is actually in a reverse lookup zone, not a forward lookup zone. But anything forward, just know forward is always going to be name or service to IP. Anything in the reverse is always going to be IP to name or service. Now, usually you don't think of DNS, most people don't think of DNS as working that way, where you know the IP address, but you want to resolve it to a name. Many security appliances actually require a reverse lookup zone. So when it takes a name and that name gets resolved to an address, it'll then run a reverse check to say, okay, I want to query DNS for this IP address, and DNS find a pointer record and let me know if the name on this pointer record matches the name that I've resolved when I connected to the host. So it's kind of a way to verify that you are who you say you are. Checks your name to IP, then runs a reverse query to say, I want to make sure that IP resolves back to that name. But those are the most common record types we will have in DNS. Now, there are a few ways to create records. You can manually create records in DNS using the Windows Admin Center. You can use the DNS Manager, just the graphical tool itself. You could create records using Windows PowerShell. Not common to do any of those. One of the most beneficial things about DNS is this dynamic creation of records. Your clients will automatically register their name and IP addresses with the DNS server. So every time you connect to the network, it's going to query DNS and say, I need to register. Whatever the computer name is, whatever IP address it has, attempts to register in DNS. If your IP address changes, no worries. It's going to automatically update that in DNS. If you rename a computer account, no worries. Automatically updates that in DNS. If you join a new machine to the domain, again, no worries. When it gets joined to the domain, connects to the network, it's going to automatically create its own host A record in DNS, maybe a pointer record if we have a reverse lookup zone as well, or host quad A if you're using IP version 6. Really, DNS can be one of those services that I always say you can set it and forget it. Now, it is extremely important, and it can be a little difficult to troubleshoot. But once you have your DNS server deployed, there's not a lot of administration that actually goes along with it. Very much a one-time configuration. From that point forward, it just works.